Welcome everyone. My name is Rachel Barrett. I'm Head of Academy Services Sector for Duncan and Topless. So I'm really delighted to be able to host this webinar for you today. It's become really clear from the numerous contacts that we've had after our recent TES magazine article and also the ESFA Power Hour with HMRC VAT specialists, which did actually have over 500 attendees, that this is an area of great concern for our trust. I'm therefore delighted to introduce Christine Newitt, who will be presenting to you today. Christine is a director at Duncan & Topless and our head of VAT, with considerable experience of dealing with all aspects of indirect taxation, direct taxation and tax planning. So if you do have any questions during the presentation, please can I ask that you drop them into the Q&A and we'll save some time at the end to go through them for you. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Christine.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. I'm now just going to share my slides and hopefully you can all see that. So yes, as Rachel says, that's me, Christine Newitt, and I head up the VAT team here at Duncan and Topless. And as Rachel said, there seems to be quite a lot of need for academies to go back maybe to some of the more fundamental principles of VAT, and that's really my aim today, to just go through some of the basics, because if you understand the basics you can normally get to the right answer, but obviously if you can't get to the right answer, we're always here to support our clients. So I'm going to run through some fundamental principles. Got the section 33B refund scheme. Look a little bit at registration, because not all academies are VAT registered. Look a little bit around business and non-business apportionment methods, partial exemption, which I know scares quite a lot of people, and then just a brief look at some of the income streams, some of the business income streams particularly that academies can get involved in, and then just sort of one or two sundry items at the end. So if I move forward, so looking at the fundamental principles on VAT. So UK VAT is charged on supplies of goods and services. The supply must be in the UK for UK VAT to be charged, and the supply must be by a taxable person. So you must be VAT registered in order to charge VAT on your supplies to your customers. And the supply must also be considered as being in the course or furtherance of a business in order to charge VAT on that supply. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because that is quite a fundamental principle for academies in particular. So you would charge VAT unless it comes within, your particular supply comes within one of the reliefs. So perhaps it might be a zero rated supply, an exempt supply, or outside the scope of VAT altogether, as in it is a non-business supply. And all those three types of reliefs look like they give the same effect in that you don't charge VAT, but actually it's quite important to be able to differentiate between those three different types of income stream in order to work out whether you can actually recover any VAT on expenses that you're incurring. So I'm going to drill down into this a little bit further for you. So output tax, so that is the VAT that you charge to your customers on your supply. So if it is a positive rate of VAT, so the standard rate, as probably most of you know, is 20%, you would be expected to charge 20% VAT and pay that over to HM Custom and Excise, or HM Revenue and Customs as they are now. You can only charge VAT though if you are VAT registered. So for all those non-VAT registered academies, you don't need to give any consideration to charging VAT on your supplies. But I will come back to that a little bit later, because you can't just ignore it. There is some monitoring that needs to be done. You have to raise a valid VAT invoice, and then the input tax is the VAT that you incur on your purchases, and the input tax is the bit that you can reclaim. So you would charge VAT on the supplies you make to your customers, and any costs you incur in making that supply, if there's VAT on those costs, you'll be able to recover that. So then the next part of the fundamental principles of VAT is that whether it is in the course or furtherance of a business, so is it a business supply or is it a non-business supply? And HM Revenue and Customs have recently updated their guidance on what constitutes, say, business activity, but actually when you drill down into it, it's not much different to their previous guidance. They've just given a couple of stages there. The first stage is the activity results in a supply of goods or services. So you've actually got to be supplying something, and there's got to be a legal relationship between the supplier and the person receiving that supply. And then stage 2, that should say, the supply is made for the purpose of obtaining income or remuneration therefrom, and there's got to be sort of a direct or sufficient link between the supply that you're making and the payment that you're receiving. So as an academy, you're providing education effectively free of charge to recipients. So therefore it isn't a business activity. So ordinarily you wouldn't even need to consider VAT. You wouldn't have any way of recovering VAT because you cannot be VAT registered if the only supplies you are making are non-business supplies. So you're supplying education free of charge to the pupils, albeit it is funded by the government. Therefore, under normal VAT rules, then you would not be recovering any VAT. But the refund scheme that was introduced in 2011 allowed academies to obtain a refund of VAT incurred, to put them basically on a similar footing to the local authority schools at the time. So this is where you get into the VAT 126 territory, which I'm sure all academies will be familiar with. So it's a claim form specifically for what are known as Section 33 bodies, of which the local authority is a Section 33 body, but academies were not. So that's why you've got this extra section within 33, and it's called 33B. There are other categories in that section as well for other types of businesses, but 33B is the one that covers academies. So only non-business input tax, so the VAT you're incurring on your purchases for making that supply of free education to your pupils, can be claimed on that VAT 126 form. The majority of academies are not VAT registered unless they are required to be registered. So you would just be completing that VAT 126. But the reason it's important to look at whether you are making any business supplies is that there may be a requirement to register for VAT if your supplies reach a certain threshold. So the registration threshold for VAT is £85,000. So if you're making taxable supplies and they go over that threshold, when you're looking backwards over the last 12 months, and that's a rolling 12-month period, so each month that you get to, you're looking back over the previous 11 months and the month that that has currently ended. And if you discover that, well, actually my business supplies that are taxable, and that's taxable at either the standard rate or the zero rate, you have to notify HMRC within 30 days of the end of that month. Or if looking forward, you think you're going to go over that 85,000 of taxable supplies in the next 30 days, then you would then need to register within 30 days of becoming aware of that fact. You are also able to register voluntarily. So even if your turnover from taxable supplies that you're making doesn't exceed that 85,000 threshold, you can still voluntarily register. Most academies wouldn't do this because it tends to be businesses that voluntarily register where they can recover VAT on zero rated supplies, so they end up in a VAT recovery situation. Excuse me. So really the threshold you're going to be focused on is the 85,000. So just looking a little bit at the administration of VAT, if you're not VAT registered, then you just submit your VAT claims on the VAT 126 form for any expenditure you incur on delivering that free education to the children. So just your non-business expenditure. You cannot then recover, if you're not VAT registered, any of your expenditure that specifically relates to business income. And we'll come on a little bit later regarding if you've got some expenditure that could relate to both, and that's when we'll come on to talk about how you apportion that expenditure. So if you're not VAT registered, it's fairly straightforward in terms of the VAT 126 claim form. You submit that at the end of a month. There's no specific periods, it just has to be filed at the end of the month. If you are VAT registered, then the amount of administration increases. You are in a much stricter regime. You file your VAT returns monthly or quarterly. E-filing is mandatory, so you've got to get signed up for what's known as Making Tax Digital with your government gateway account and all that side of things. There is a penalty and interest regime for incorrect VAT returns and late filing and late payments as well. So you're in a much stricter regime. Obviously, if there are errors on your VAT 126, there will still be consequences to that, and you're encouraged to correct returns that are, or claims that are incorrect. So that's why it's important to understand the principles of that, because you've got to account for the correct amount of output tax on your supplies. So you've got to be able to identify which supplies you're making you should actually be charging VAT on. And you've also got to work out how much of the VAT that you're incurring can be claimed back. And as an ease of administration, you don't have to do a VAT 126 for your non-business and a VAT return for your business. They will allow you to put the VAT 126 claim on your VAT return if you are VAT registered. So you account for output tax on all your taxable supplies at the appropriate rate of VAT, and then establish if your supplies are non-business, taxable, and at what rate. Are they exempt, your supplies, or are they outside the scope? So if we then look a little bit at what's deductible, you are allowed to reclaim input tax relating to your non-business supplies, as we've already said, and your taxable business supplies. You cannot reclaim VAT on exempt business supplies. That is subject to what is known as de minimis limits. So there is a calculation to do to work out whether you pass that test or fail that test, to work out exactly how much VAT you might be able to claim on your exempt business supplies. So the complexity arises really for academies because you're likely to be making a mixture of all these types of supplies. So there's the business, non-business calculation that you need to get to grips with to determine how much VAT you can reclaim if you're a non-VAT registered academy. And then the next stage is looking at the partial exemption calculation. So there's two tiers effectively to the calculation. There's business, non-business, and how do we split that in terms of expenditure that you're trying to reclaim. And then once you've got that business expenditure, how do we split that between whether a supply is a taxable supply or whether it is an exempt supply. So the first step is the recording. So if you're recording VAT incurred, what you're trying to do with each invoice that you get, you're looking at it and saying, well, can I recover this VAT? So in order to do that, you need to work out whether that particular purchase that the Academy has made is for a non-business supply, or is it for a business supply? If it is for a business supply and the Academy is VAT registered, what type of business supply? Is it a taxable supply or an exempt supply? So the first stage is for each item of expenditure that the Academy is incurring, you need to have within your accounting system a way of coding things into these different categories. Some purchases will be used to make business, both taxable and exempt supplies, and non-business supplies. So this is where we need to look at the apportionment rules, because unless the expenditure, so if you get an invoice for, for your school meals, and you know that all those meals relate to pupils, then you know that's wholly relating to your non-business supply of education, and we're going to come on to looking at what falls in that category and what doesn't fall into that category a little bit later. So if it wholly relates to one type of supply, then you just pop it in that box, right? That goes in the non-business box, or it goes in the business taxable, or it goes into the business exempt. But you might have some that are across all the different, so for example, your utilities bill, like your heating bill or your telephone bill, you think, well, I use that for, for sort of the school education side of things, but I also take bookings for the hall or whatever it may be. So you know that, that particular item of expenditure goes across the whole range of activities that the Academy undertakes. So this is where this two-tier calculation comes in. So with that invoice, you've got to apportion it between business and non-business to start with. And that's all you would need to do if you're not a VAT registered business. You wouldn't need to do that apportionment any further. If you are VAT registered, you would then need to look at the apportionment of that business element of that expenditure as to whether it just relates to taxable supplies, exempt, or whether it relates to both. And if it relates to both, it's classed as residual input tax, and that goes in what we call the pot to be split further. So then that's the second part of that calculation, to split it down even further. So most overhead expenditure will go into what we call the pot. As I say, heating the building where all of the Academy's activities will take place. So it's going to be difficult to allocate that to one particular income stream. So attribution is quite important. So one method of doing this split is based on turnover, and that is generally what most academies use. For the first stage of the calculation. So if we look at that diagram on there, I've got the income for the year. I've just done this based on a full year to the 31st of August. So the total income for this Academy is 1.5 million, and we've worked out that 1.39 million of that is non-business, which leaves 110,000 of it as business expenditure, and of that 110,000, that is split 50,000 of that was taxable after you'd coded it all in your system. That's the figure that popped out as the total. And 60,000 of it is exempt. So when you're splitting on turnover, you would look at the business, non-business proportion, and the non-business is 92.67% of the total turnover of the academy. So therefore, on your utility bill, which you've decided is going to be across the whole range there of taxable, exempt and non-business, you would be able to claim 92.67% of that against your non-business Section 33 claim. So if you're not VAT registered, you would then not be looking at recovering any of the rest of that VAT. If you are VAT registered, then you would then go down to the next tier of the calculation and say, right, of that total business income that I'm receiving, how is that split? And that's roughly 45 to 55% that is split. So when we're looking at a utility bill, if I put it in sort of an example, it's probably clearer to understand. Got this utility bill, it's got £2,500 of VAT on this utility bill, and you split it down according to those percentages. The amount that you can definitely reclaim is the £2,316.75 and the taxable amount of £83.29. The exempt amount of £99.96 you may or may not be able to reclaim, and I'll come on to that calculation in a moment. You can now, on the first tier of the calculation, use any reasonable apportionment method to split out non-business expenditure for business expenditure. So, for example, your telephone bill, you could say, well, actually, the majority of that is school. I would say, looking at the calls we make, 99% is non-business. And as long as you've got something to support that, you could put 99%. So on that particular nominal code for telephone bills, you could have that set up on your accounting system to say, well, if we get a telephone bill, it will always be 99% non-business and 1% business. So you don't have to use a particular method to do that first tier of the calculation. You do, though, have to use a particular method for the second tier of the calculation. That must be on a turnover basis under the standard method for partial exemption. So I'll just come on to that. So to just recap a little bit, because it's not, as you're probably already gathering, it's not the easiest thing to get your head round. It's probably head in a cold flannel in a dark room with a pad and paper might be easier to write it down. So your input tax, just to recap, is analysed into three categories. So your input tax is the VAT you're incurring on your expenditure. So any VAT that you're incurring on your expenditure, you're putting it into three categories. Input tax on goods or services for the purpose of making taxable supplies, for the purpose of making exempt supplies, and for those which actually you can't say it's wholly one or wholly the other when you're looking at your business expenditure. And that's the bit that needs to be apportioned. So the de minimis limits that I talked about earlier, this only applies to VAT registered academies because we're only at this point looking at your business income, and you've already registered for VAT at this point because you're over that threshold. So you've got to be, you're in this regime of doing this calculation whether you like it or not, unfortunately. And just incidentally, this isn't a set of rules that is just dreamed up for academies. It applies to all businesses that make both taxable and exempt business supplies. So this is a standard method which does differ slightly from local authorities. They have a different set of tests that they can use, but this is what academies need to use, which is the same as any other regular business. So once you've worked out what your exempt input tax is, so as you remember on that previous example, we'd worked out £99 and that had gone into exempt, and then we got this pot as well, some of which might be exempt, and it's when you're adding all these things up, you then, once you've added them all up for your particular VAT period, whether that's monthly or quarterly, you're then saying to yourself, well, is that no more than 50% of the total business input tax that I've incurred? And is it also less than £1,875 per quarter or £625 per month? And then once you've done that for each period, you've then got to look at it for the entire year. Most academies will request a VAT year to the 31st of August, which isn't a usual VAT year. VAT years normally run to March, April or May, but it is possible for academies to request a VAT year end of 31st of August, because obviously it just makes so much more sense for it to be at that point. So then you'd look at it for the whole year and decide whether there's any adjustment to make for the year. So if you're a person that has the head in the numbers, which hopefully you are, I'll run through how that works in terms of the numbers. So if we just focus on that slide in terms of Q1, these are the totals that you've worked out. So you've worked out that your total input tax, this is just on the business expenditure, because you've already dealt with the non-business expenditure, that's already been separated out. So we're looking at total input tax in Q1 there of 16,500. And the way that you've allocated it in your accounting records, you've ended up with a total of £10,000 that purely relates to taxable supplies, £5,000 that purely relates to exempt supplies, and then £1,500 that is a little bit to do with exempt and a little bit to do with taxable. So you couldn't apportion, you've got to apportion it. You can't put it to one or the other in the top two boxes. Your taxable turnover in this example is 100,000. And then when you look at that in terms of your total business turnover, that represents 40% of your total business turnover. So the rest of it is exempt turnover. So you apply that 40% to that pot figure of £1,500, and then you add that to the purely exempt input tax. So your 40% of 1,500 is £900, plus the £5,000 that you know is exempt. You don't need to apportion any of that. You've ended up with exempt input tax of £5,900. Is that less than £625 per month? No. So you've failed the de minimis test, because you've got to answer yes to both of those tests to pass that de minimis test. It is less than 50% of the total input tax. This 5,900 is less than 50% of 16,500. And so it passes that test, but it's got to pass both tests to be able to claim that £5,900. So the claim that you would make on your VAT return in relation to business expenditure for that quarter would be 10,600. So that's your 16.5, which is the total VAT that you've incurred on your expenditure, less the 5,900, which you've just worked out that you can't recover. So that leaves you with 10,600 that you can claim on your VAT return. You then do that calculation for every quarter. So you've got Q2 there. has come out with a similar result. You've not passed both tests. But then quarter 3, oh, we've passed both tests in that quarter. We didn't have much exempt input tax in that quarter, so I can claim all of my input tax back in that quarter. And then when you get to quarter 4, you've failed one of the tests again. So you can only recover part of it. So then when you come to do the annual calculation, you would do that based on the overall figures for the year and working out total taxable turnover as percentage of total business turnover. That's where you end up with your 42% percentage. And when you apply that to the total pot for the year and add it onto your exempt input VAT, you find you've failed the test for the year. So although you've recovered some VAT in quarter 3, you shouldn't have recovered all of it. So there's £1,409 that you've effectively got to pay back to HM Revenue and Customs when you get to the year end. Now I know that's a quick run through, but hopefully that gives you some indication of how the calculation works. So when I say that you've got to use this method, you've got to use the standard method unless you apply for a special method, which has to be approved by HM Revenue and Customs. So if you have a partial exemption method and you don't think it's producing a fair result, then you can apply for a special method, and there's different bases on which you can then apply for apportionment of that pot expenditure. It could be on floor area if you know that more of the floor area is used for taxable activity than exempt, staff time or staff numbers. So there are different methods, but generally you need to be talking about quite a large amount of VAT to make it worth applying for. So just moving on to some more specifics around academies. So academies are charities, and charity status gives you certain advantages. Some supplies which aren't normally 0 rated are 0 rated when they're supplied to a charity, and there are some supplies made which are not ordinarily exempt for other businesses but are exempt from VAT when they're supplied by a charity. So you've got a two-way thing there. So when you get invoices in from suppliers where you've requested an advertising service, so it might be placing an advert for a new member of staff, you need to tell that supplier that you are a charity, and they'll request your charity status and some details from you regarding that, and they should not be charging you VAT on that invoice. And this can be any sort of advertising that you undertake as a charity. It doesn't have to be an advert for staff. It can just be like promoting the school generally. And then goods connected with collecting donations, they're 0 rated for charities. So if you're buying any little charity donation collecting pots. And there are certain building and construction works as well where it's used solely for charitable purposes. Excuse me, where the builder will 0 rate that work. So it is important to understand that VAT is charged correctly, because you can only recover VAT that's been charged correctly. If it's been charged incorrectly, you can't recover it. So if it should be 0 rated, then you need to make sure that you're getting the right invoices from your supplier. And then exempt supplies by charities. There's various different areas that may apply here. So admission to events and sales of items at charity events, admission to cultural events. One that impacts academies quite a lot is the sports and physical recreation activities. There's an exemption there that is specifically for charities and not for any other businesses. And then provision of certain public natured educational activities or welfare services, they all have their own VAT exemptions. So basically, when you're looking at your income streams, there are two categories which you need to be coding correctly within your accounting records. There's the provision of education and closely related supplies. That's your section 33B claim, and those are the bits that you can put on your VAT 126 if you're not registered. And then there's your business income streams, and even if you're not VAT registered, you need to monitor those against the registration threshold, because if you start to approach that registration threshold, there's a requirement then to look at whether you need to register. And if you need to register, you then need to be accounting for VAT on those taxable supplies. So what are your non-business supplies? So clearly the government funding you receive for providing the education to the children, to your pupils, but there's also any charges you make to pupils for what are known as closely related supplies. So catering, your school meals. If you're a boarding school, then the accommodation would be classed as closely related. So any fees that you charge for accommodation would be within that non-business supply category. Any transport that's laid on for pupils, any field trips that you undertake. So any expenditure that you're incurring on these, you'll be able to put as part of your VAT 126 claim. And also musical instruments that are under the assisted instrument purchase scheme. So those are basically your non-business supplies. And then business income streams will be a whole host of things. So I've just listed a few on there. The full presentation for this does run to quite a few slides. So I've just condensed it down all to one slide to just give you a flavour of the types of income you should be monitoring to determine whether you should be registered for VAT. And if you are already an academy that's registered for VAT, you will need to know what the particular status of these items are as to whether you should be charging VAT at standard rate or whether they're zero rated or whether they're exempt. And as with most things with VAT, it often depends. Just a very brief run through catering for other than pupils. So if you're providing school meals for staff and visitors, or indeed providing a catering service to another school, then that's all taxable at the standard rate. Tuck shop sales, they would be taxable supplies. It depends exactly what you're selling as to which bits might be zero rated, because certain items of food are zero rated and others are standard rated. Your school uniform sales, they're not closely related, so they don't come under the non-business. So you're then needing to determine whether they're new or second-hand donated items. It's also dependent on the age of the children as well on uniforms as to whether they're standard rated or zero rated. But for primary schools, you could probably assume, unless you've got any very, very large children, you would just generally go with what the supplier puts on their invoice. So if they're charging VAT, then you would assume that is of a sizing that requires standard rating VAT to be charged. Second-hand donated items by a charity, if you're selling those, so if parents are donating second-hand items of clothing, they would be zero rated because of your charity status. School photographs, they would be standard rated. Sales and books and computers, and this is an area you need to be quite careful because some of these may be closely related to your non-business supply of education, but others may not be, and they would be standard rated. Hiring out of premises is another area that can be quite tricky because it depends what you're hiring it out for. So some of this will be standard rated, definitely your car parking, if you're providing car parking facilities or facilities for storing equipment. If you're looking at hiring out a hall for a function, so a private function where you're providing more than just the room, so you may have catering services provided with that, then that is likely to be taxable. But the other, if it's just a straight hire of the hall for a community group or holiday clubs, it's more likely to come within the exempt category. So it can get a little bit tricky around hiring out of premises. Fundraising events for charities are exempt, but there are conditions you've got to fulfil in order to get that exemption. Also, if you're supplying staff to other schools, there are exemptions around there, but there are also some areas where that would be taxable. And also, if you're providing sort of mentoring or consultancy services to other schools, you've got to look at exactly what services you're providing. Some of those could come under the education exemption, but some of them may be standard rated. So it's a real mixed bag when we're looking at these business income streams. And then just finally, before I go to questions, just some sundry items to be aware of here that we would always recommend you to seek advice on. If you do have a trading subsidiary connected to your academy, they do not have charity status. So the rules that I've just been through in terms of specifics that relate to the academy because they have charity status will not apply necessarily to trading subsidiaries. So if you do have a trading subsidiary, it's quite important to just get some advice to make sure that it's set up in a particular way and that you are maximising the VAT reliefs that are available. Also, if you're undertaking any building works for capital projects and you're looking at whether you can recover the VAT, the rules are quite complex. It depends on the use to which the building is being put. You may recall on the zero rating slide there that there are some supplies to charities that could be zero rated. So you need to make sure that the developer or the constructor is charging you the correct rate of VAT, which could well be a zero rate of VAT. Also, if you're receiving any services from overseas suppliers, something known as the reverse charge mechanism applies there. I don't see it very often with academies. I have seen it with private schools where they've employed agents to encourage overseas students to come to their school, and that counts as a taxable supply, or rather it counts towards your taxable turnover when working out whether you should be registered or not. So just be aware of any foreign invoices basically that come into your inbox, and make sure you ask the questions to what you should be doing with them. And then there's some VAT that you incur that's completely blocked from recovery. The only one that's likely, and then even not very likely, to be incurred by an academy is business entertaining. So if you're doing any entertaining, not staff entertaining, it would be, promotional activities for the school, would be blocked from any recovery at all. So you would just put that to one side and not recover it. And that brings me quite nicely to the end, and I'm not sure whether we have any questions or not. Rachel, do we have some?
Hi Christine, yes, so we haven't got any questions in the question box at all, but if anyone has any questions, we'll just give it a minute or so. But really I just want to say thank you very much, Christine, for that. It's very clear that VAT is a complex area with the amount of detail that we go into, and I am aware that we had a little chat beforehand, and the list of various items that we could go into, the slides was a whole lot longer than this, and actually you do whole afternoons going through these complexities with VAT. So it isn't straightforward, and we can totally understand why academies are seeking more support at the moment. And we are doing quite a lot of VAT reviews just to give that reassurance that people are claiming the right things in the right manner. So, you know, if you have had anything that's come up today that you think you ought to have a second look at, we're more than happy for you to get in contact with us, and we can have a look at that for you. We don't seem to have any more questions come up, so thank you for attending, everyone. We will be putting this onto YouTube later on, so when we got into all those details about how to claim under the exempt rules, you will be able to go back through all of that and try and get your head around them with that wet fog panel on your forehead that Christine mentioned. But thank you very much, everyone, for attending today.